The date is August 21st, 1945. The place is Los Alamos, New Mexico, a secret city built on a mesa, hidden from the world. The war is technically over. The bombs have fallen on Japan. The world is taking its first breath of the new atomic age. But in a quiet laboratory, amidst the pine trees and the dust, a third heart is beating. It is a sphere of plutonium, weighing 6.2 kilograms. It is about the size of a softball. To the naked eye, it looks harmless, a dull, grey metal ball. If you were to touch it, which you should never do, it would feel warm. It is generating its own heat, a constant, simmering energy, like a living thing. The scientists call it Rufus, but history will give it a different name. It will be known as the Demon Core. On this summer night, a physicist named Harry Dullion is working alone. He is building a brick wall around the core, reflecting its neutrons back into itself, seeing how close he can get it to a critical state without unleashing the monster. It is a game of brinksmanship. He places a tungsten carbide brick on the stack. His hand trembles just for a fraction of a second. The brick slips. It falls onto the core. Immediately, the air in the room glows with a sudden, intense blue light. A wave of heat washes over him. Harry knocks the brick off, stopping the reaction, but it is too late. The demon has awakened. He feels a tingling in his hand. He packs up his notes, walks to the hospital, and dies a slow, agonizing death over the next 25 days. The core goes back into storage, waiting for its next victim.
Fast forward 9 months, May 21st, 1946. The core is still there, sitting in the lab. The scientists have not learned to fear it enough. They have developed a nickname for the experiments they conduct on it. They call it Tickling the Dragon's Tail. The head physicist is Loomis Slotin. He is brilliant, brave, and reckless. He is known for wearing blue jeans and cowboy boots, and for bypassing safety protocols. On this Tuesday afternoon, he is showing a group of colleagues how to bring the core to the edge of criticality. There are no robotic arms here, no lead glass walls. Slotin is using his hands. He has the plutonium core nestled inside 2 half-spheres of beryllium. By lowering the top half over the core, he bounces neutrons back into the center. If the 2 halves close completely, the core will go critical and release a burst of lethal radiation. To keep the shells apart, to keep the dragon asleep, Slotin is using the tip of a simple, flathead screwdriver. He holds the handle, twisting it gently, lowering the shell millimeter by millimeter. The only thing standing between the men in that room and an atomic disaster is the steadiness of one man's wrist. The room is silent, save for the rhythmic clicking of the Geiger counter. Click, click, click. The men lean in, watching the metal shells. It is the ultimate gamble.
And then the screwdriver slips. The sound of the metal tool hitting the floor echoes like a gunshot. The top shell of beryllium drops, closing the sphere completely. The circuit is completed. The core goes critical. It happens in a microsecond. The room is flooded with a flash of blue light, brighter than the midday sun, yet casting no shadows. It is not a light you see with your eyes. It is the light caused by high-energy particles hitting the fluid inside your eyeballs. It is the blue glow of Cherenkov radiation. Slotin jerks his hand up, throwing the beryllium shell to the floor. The reaction stops. The blue light vanishes. The whole event lasted less than a second. But in that second, the world changed. Slotin reports feeling a wave of heat across his skin and a strange, sour taste in his mouth, like sucking on a penny. That is the taste of ionization, the taste of your own cells decomposing. He looks at his colleagues. They are frozen in terror. Slotin speaks calmly. Well, he says, that does it. He knows.
He looks at the diagram of where everyone was standing. He calculates the distance. He tells the man standing closest to him, "You'll be okay." Then he looks at his own hands. They are already beginning to tingle.
They leave the lab calmly, walking out into the New Mexico sunshine. But they are walking dead men, or at least Slotin is. The radiation he absorbed in that single second was a lethal dose. Over the next 9 days, Louis Slotin falls apart. It is a horrific biological disintegration. His white blood cell count drops to 0. His skin blisters and peels. His internal organs fail one by one. He maintains his sanity almost to the end, dictating notes to the doctors, describing his own death for the sake of science. He dies on May 30th, 1946. The demon core had claimed its second life. The military finally decided that the sphere was too dangerous to be kept. It was not stored, it was executed. The core was melted down, mixed with other plutonium, and forged into new cores for nuclear weapons that were eventually detonated in tests over the Pacific Ocean. The demon core is gone, but the shadow it cast remains. It taught us that the invisible world is not to be trifled with. It taught us that the line between a scientific breakthrough and a silent, invisible death is as thin as the blade of a screwdriver. Welcome to the dreamscape of history. Dim the lights, check your Geiger counters, and let us walk into the atomic shadow.
It is September 1987. The location is Goiânia, a bustling city in central Brazil. The heat is stifling, waves of distortion rising from the pavement. In the ruins of an abandoned medical clinic, the Instituto Goiano de Radiotherapy, 2 men are hunting for scrap metal. Roberto and Wagner are scavengers. They are looking for copper, steel, anything they can sell to a junkyard to buy food. They find a heavy, rotating assembly in one of the crumbling rooms. It looks like a piece of high-tech machinery left behind in the rush to close the clinic. They don't know that it is a teletherapy unit, a machine designed to blast cancer tumors with radiation. They pry it loose. It is incredibly heavy, shielded by lead. They put it in a wheelbarrow and drag it home, thinking they have struck gold. They have no idea that they are dragging a Trojan horse into their community. Inside that lead canister sits a small capsule containing cesium-137, a radioactive isotope with a half-life of 30 years. That night, in Roberto's backyard, they begin to dismantle it. They take hammers and chisels to the lead casing. As they break through the seal, they are hit with a wave of nausea. Both men vomit. They assume it is something they ate, or perhaps the heat. They ignore the sickness, because deep inside the machine, they see a faint, mesmerizing blue light leaking out. They manage to extract the capsule. It is small, about the size of a thimble, but inside there is a powder, a salt-like substance that glows in the dark with an ethereal, supernatural blue hue. They sell the scrap metal to a local junkyard owner named Dever Alves. Dever is a man who appreciates the strange and the beautiful. When he sees the glowing blue powder, he is entranced. He thinks it is magical. He thinks he has found a gemstone,
or perhaps something extraterrestrial. He takes the capsule into his house. He turns off the lights. He invites his family and neighbors to come and see the carnival glitter. The awe in that room must have been palpable. Here was a light that required no electricity, a dust that looked like crushed stars. De Vere is generous. He wants to share the beauty. He pries the capsule open further. He distributes the glowing grains to his brothers, his friends. They rub it on their skin like makeup. They marvel at how they shine in the dark. It is a scene of innocent wonder, a group of people playing with the deadliest fire in the universe, completely unaware that the blue light is actually the ionization of the air caused by high-energy particles shredding their DNA.
The horror begins with a sandwich. De Vere's 6-year-old niece, Led de Navis, comes to visit. She is sitting on the floor, playing with the blue dust. It is lunchtime. She is eating a sandwich. She doesn't wash her hands. Why would she? The dust is pretty. She eats the bread, and with it she ingests the cesium-137. Within hours, the town begins to fall ill. It is not just nausea anymore. People's skin begins to turn red, then black. Burns appear where the dust touched them, lesions that will not heal. Hair falls out in clumps. De Vere's wife, Maria Gabriella, is the first to suspect the magical blue powder. She notices that everyone who touched it is sick. She is a woman of immense courage. She takes the remnants of the capsule, wraps it in a plastic bag, and takes a bus to the hospital. Imagine that ride. A woman sitting on a public bus holding a plastic bag containing enough radiation to kill the entire street. She is vomiting, dizzy, but she holds on to the bag. By bringing it to the doctors, she saves the city, but she seals her own fate.
When the doctors bring a Geiger counter near the bag, the device screams. It goes off the scale. They think the machine is broken. They get another one. It screams too. The realization hits the government like a bomb. This is not a flu outbreak. It is a nuclear disaster in the middle of a neighborhood. The response is swift and brutal. Tyvek suits, lead walls, and yellow tape. They demolish houses. They scrape the topsoil off the earth. They kill the family pets that had walked through the dust. The tragedy of Lede de Navis, the girl who ate the blue dust, is the heartbreaking center of this story. She becomes highly radioactive. She is isolated in a hospital room where no one can touch her without protective gear. She dies a month later. Her burial was a scene of medieval fear. The locals, terrified that her body would poison the ground, threw stones at her coffin. They tried to stop the burial. She was laid to rest in a special fiberglass coffin lined with lead, which was then filled with concrete. She was 6 years old. The blue dust incident is one of the worst radiological accidents in history. It reminds us that beauty can be a trap. That blue glow, so alluring in the dark, was a siren song. And in the atomic age, what you don't know can burn you from the inside out.
If you looked at a Soviet map in 1957, you would see a blank space in the Ural Mountains. There were forests, lakes, and rivers, but no roads leading to them, no names, no dots marking a town. But in that blank space, 70,000 people lived and worked. This was City 40, later known as Ozersk. It was a closed city,
the secret heart of the Soviet nuclear weapons program. It was here, at the Mayak Production Association, that the plutonium for the first Soviet atomic bomb was refined. The people who lived here were privileged. They had better food, better apartments, and better schools than the rest of the USSR. But the price of their comfort was their existence. They could not leave. They could not write to their families. They were ghosts in a gilded cage. But the real horror wasn't the secrecy, it was the waste. In the rush to build the bomb and catch up to the Americans, safety was a luxury they didn't afford. For years, they dumped high-level radioactive waste directly into the Teca River. The villagers downstream used that water. They bathed in it, fished in it, and drank it. They began to die of mysterious river diseases. But the factory kept humming, pouring poison into the veins of the earth. On September 29, 1957, the bill came due. Deep underground, in a concrete canyon known as Complex 14, there were massive steel tanks. Each one contained 80 tons of liquid radioactive waste. These tanks were hot, boiling with the heat of decaying isotopes. They required constant cooling to keep them stable. But in one of the tanks, the cooling lines had failed. No one noticed. For days, the liquid inside boiled away, evaporating until only highly explosive nitrate salts and radioactive dust remained. The temperature rose and rose until it reached 350 degrees Celsius. At 4:20 p.m., the tank could take no more. The explosion was chemical, but the payload was nuclear. It had the force of 75 tons of TNT. It blew the 2.5-meter thick concrete lid off the silo. This lid weighed 160 tons, and it was tossed into the air like a coin. The blast shattered windows miles away and shook the ground like an earthquake. But the sound was nothing compared to what rose into the sky. A column of dust and smoke rose a kilometre into the air. It wasn't grey, it was glowing. It flickered with an eerie orange-red light. The villagers in neighbouring towns looked up and marvelled. They thought it was the aurora borealis, the northern lights. The local newspapers, controlled by the state, even printed stories the next day describing the rare and beautiful polar lights seen in the south. It was a lie. It was a cloud of cerium-144 and strontium-90. The wind grabbed the cloud and smeared it across the map. It created a scar on the face of the Earth that is still there today, known as the East Urals radioactive trace. 20,000 square miles were contaminated. The evacuation was slow and cruel. The military didn't tell the villagers why they had to leave. Soldiers arrived in lead-lined trucks, ordering peasants to kill their livestock and burn their crops. They buried the houses, they ploughed the contaminated soil under, but they didn't have enough protective gear. Young soldiers were sent to clean up the radioactive debris with shovels and rags. They were marching into an invisible fire. For 30 years, the world knew nothing. The CIA had vague rumors of a nuclear accident in the Urals, caused perhaps by a Soviet nuclear test gone wrong. But the Soviet Union kept the lid on the coffin tight. It wasn't until 1989, after Chernobyl, that the government admitted what had happened at Kyshtym. Today, the Mayak plant is still there. City 40 is still there. But the land around it is a graveyard. The Teca River is fenced off with barbed wire, a ribbon of death winding through the forest. There is a strange irony in the exclusion zone. Because humans cannot live there, nature has returned. It is officially designated
as the East Ural Nature Reserve. Trees grow tall, and deer roam through the ruins of the buried villages. But the scientists who study them find that the animals are not right. They carry the legacy of 1957 in their bones. It is a beautiful, silent landscape, a place where the leaves rustle in the wind and the water flows clear. But if you stand there, in the city that did not exist, you are standing in the shadow of the third worst nuclear disaster in human history. A disaster that happened in the dark and stayed in the dark for half a lifetime.
The year is 1917. The Great War is raging in Europe. Men are dying in the trenches. But back home in Orange, New Jersey, a group of young women believe they have found the luckiest job in America. They are working for the United States Radium Corporation. They sit in rows at long wooden tables in a sunlit factory, painting the dials of watches. These watches are destined for the soldiers on the front lines. The numbers on the faces are painted with a special, magical substance called undark. It is a mixture of zinc sulfide and a newly discovered element, radium. It glows with a bright, constant green luminescence, allowing soldiers to see the time in the pitch-black trenches. For the girls, it is elite work. It pays 3 times more than typical factory jobs. They are teenagers, full of life and vanity. And why wouldn't they be? They are working with a miracle cure. In the 1920s, radium was considered a health tonic. It was in toothpaste, water, and cosmetics. It was the essence of vitality. To paint the tiny numbers, the girls are taught a specific technique. The brushes are made of camel hair, and they lose their point quickly. So the supervisors teach them to lip, dip, paint. Put the brush in your mouth to sharpen the tip, dip it in the radioactive paint, and paint the number. Lip, dip, paint. They do this hundreds of times a day, ingesting a little bit of the sun with every stroke.
The danger was invisible, but the side effects were beautiful. At first, the dust from the paint covered everything. It settled on their clothes, their hair, and their skin. When the girls walked home at night, they literally glowed. They were known as the Ghost Girls. It became a fashion statement. They would wear their best dresses to work so they would shine at the dance halls later. Some even painted their teeth with the radium for a glowing smile. But inside their bodies, the radium was masquerading. To the human body, radium looks exactly like calcium. So, when the girls swallowed it, their bodies didn't flush it out. They eagerly absorbed it, depositing it directly into their bones. It wasn't just sitting there, it was bombarding their marrow with alpha particles, shattering their skeletons from the inside out. The horror began slowly. A toothache here, a sore joint there. Molly Maggia was the first. Her tooth began to rot. The dentist pulled it, but the wound didn't heal. It grew into a painful, oozing abscess. Then the next tooth rotted, and the next. Her jawbone began to feel strange, soft. One day her dentist reached in to examine a loose piece of bone. He pulled gently, and Molly's entire lower jawbone came out in his hand. It had not broken, it had disintegrated. Her mouth was effectively dead, while she was still alive.
As the women began to die in agonizing ways, their spines crushing under their own weight, their legs shortening as the bones dissolved, the company struck back, but not with help, with lies. The United States Radium Corporation knew.
Their own scientists wore lead aprons and used tongs to handle the paint. They knew the danger, but when the girls got sick, the company hired doctors to diagnose them with syphilis. It was a brutal, calculated slander. It ruined the reputations of these young women, shaming them into silence and hiding the true cause of their illness. But one woman, Grace Fryer, refused to go quietly into the dark. Her spine was crumbling and her teeth were gone, but her spirit was iron. It took her 2 years to find a lawyer willing to take on the powerful corporation. In 1927, 5 of the Radium girls filed a lawsuit. It was a race against time. The women were so ill they could barely raise their hands to take the oath. They testified from their deathbeds. The press went wild. The Legion of the Doomed, they called them. The image of these beautiful, dying women fighting for justice captivated the nation and finally broke the spell of the miracle element.
They won their case. They received a settlement, medical expenses, and a pension. But for most, it was too late. The radium was already in their bones, and radium stays forever. However, their suffering was not in vain. The case of the Radium Girls is one of the most important events in labor history. It led directly to the establishment of the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, OSHA. If you wear safety gear at work today, if you have the right to sue your employer for hazardous conditions, you have the Ghost Girls to thank. But there is a final, haunting postscript to their story. If you go to the cemeteries in Orange, New Jersey, or Ottawa, Illinois, and you bring a Geiger counter, you will find them. 80 years later, their graves still register radiation. Because of the half-life of radium, their bones will continue to glow underground for another 1,000 years. They are still the Ghost Girls, lighting up the earth from below, a permanent warning written in green fire. The ocean was calm on the morning of March 1st, 1954. Far out in the Pacific, 80 miles east of the Bikini Atoll, a small Japanese tuna fishing boat bobbed gently on the swells. It was named the Daigo Fukoryu Maru, the Lucky Dragon No. 5. The crew of 23 men was waking up. They were preparing their nets, hoping for a good catch of tuna to bring back to the market in Yamezu. The sky was dark, the sun not yet risen. It was a moment of perfect maritime peace. And then the west caught fire. At 6:45 a.m., the horizon didn't just brighten, it ignited. A flare of light, brighter than 1,000 suns, tore through the darkness. It shifted colors, from a blinding white to a bruised purple to a sinister red. The sailors rushed onto the deck, staring in confusion. The sun rises in the east, but this light came from the west. They stood there for 7 minutes in silence, watching the sky burn. And then the sound arrived. A deep, concussive roar rolled across the ocean like a tsunami of noise. It shook the wooden hull of the boat and rattled the bones of the men standing on the deck. They didn't know it, but they had just witnessed Castle Bravo, the detonation of the largest thermonuclear device the United States had ever tested. A hydrogen bomb 1,000 times more powerful than the one dropped on Hiroshima. The captain ordered the nets to be hauled in. They needed to leave. But the Lucky Dragon was a slow ship, and the wind was blowing the wrong way. 2 hours later, the sky changed again. A strange cloud drifted over the boat, and then it began to snow. In the middle of the tropical Pacific, where the temperature was balmy and warm, white flakes began to drift down from the heavens. It was a fine, white powder. It coated the deck, the ropes, and the hair of the sailors. It didn't melt. It was gritty, like sand, but lighter. The crew had no idea what it was. They were fascinated. They scooped it up with their bare hands. One sailor, Matashichi Oishi, even tasted it. It was gritty and had no flavor. They brushed it off their shoulders, but it stuck to their sweaty skin. It got into their eyes, their ears, and their noses. They called it Shi no Hai, the death ash. It wasn't snow. It was the pulverized remains of the coral reef from the Bikini Atoll, vaporized by the fireball, mixed with highly radioactive fission products and sucked up into the stratosphere. Now, it was raining down as lethal fallout. The men were working, eating, and breathing in a radioactive blizzard.
The voyage back to Japan took 2 weeks. It was a voyage of slow, confusing horror. By the 3rd day, the snow was gone, but the sickness had arrived. The men began to complain of headaches and nausea. Their skin, where the ash had stuck, began to turn a dark, angry red. It looked like a severe sunburn, but it didn't heal. It blistered and peeled, revealing raw flesh underneath. This was the hallmark of beta burns. Then came the hair. A sailor would run his hand through his hair, and it would come away in clumps. They stopped looking in the mirror. The pain in their joints became unbearable. The ship itself was now a radioactive source. Every piece of wood, every fish in the hold was emitting gamma rays. They were trapped in a floating coffin. When they finally limped into the port of Yaizu on March 14th, they looked like ghosts. Their faces were swollen and black. The doctors were baffled at first, but when the Geiger counters were brought in, the clicking sound was deafening. The Lucky Dragon had brought the atomic war home to Japan.
The panic that followed was total. The fish from the Lucky Dragon had already been sold and distributed to markets. Japan, the only nation to have suffered atomic bombings, was suddenly gripped by a new terror: radioactive tuna. The fish markets collapsed. People stopped eating sushi. Geiger counters were set up in grocery stores. The radio operator of the ship, Eikichi Kuboyama, took the worst of it. He hovered between life and death for 6 months. His body was ravaged by hepatitis caused by blood transfusions and the destruction of his liver by radiation. On September 23, 1954, he died. He was the first victim of the hydrogen bomb. His last words to his mother were a plea for the future. "I pray that I am the last victim of an atomic or hydrogen bomb." The Daigo Fukuryū Maru was not scrapped. It was cleaned, renamed, and eventually restored. Today, it sits in a museum in Tokyo, a wooden skeleton preserved in a glass hall. It is a silent monument to the day the sun rose in the west and the snow fell in the tropics. It reminds us that there is no such thing as a remote test. When we burn the sky, the ash has to fall somewhere.
The night of January 3rd, 1961, was bitterly cold in the high desert of Idaho. The temperature had dropped to 20 degrees below zero. Out in the middle of the sagebrush, 40 miles from the nearest town, stood a lonely cylindrical silo made of steel plate. This was the SL-1, the stationary low-power reactor number 1. It was a prototype, a small nuclear plant designed by the Army to power remote radar stations in the Arctic. It was supposed to be simple, rugged, and safe. Inside the silo, 3 young men were working the night shift: John Burns, Richard McKinley, and Richard Legg. They were there to perform a routine maintenance task. The reactor had been shut down for the holidays, and their job was to reconnect the control rods to the drive mechanisms so the plant could be started up again the next morning. It was quiet work, technical work. There were no cameras inside, no audio recorders, just the hum of the ventilation fans and the clanking of tools on metal. At 9 p.m., they checked in with the central alarm station. Everything was normal. At 9:01 p.m., a single alarm sounded at the fire station a few miles away. It wasn't a fire alarm. It was a radiation alarm. And then, silence. When the health physicists arrived at the silo, they found a ghost ship. The lights were still on. The fans were still humming. But the radiation meters in their hands spiked so hard the needles hit the stops. The levels were terrifying, hundreds of roentgens per hour. To enter that building was to walk into a microwave. They put on protective gear, breathless and terrified, and dashed inside for seconds at a time to search for the crew. They found a scene of inexplicable violence. The floor was covered in debris. Water and steam were dripping from the ceiling. They found two of the men quickly. McKinley was lying on the floor, moaning softly, but he was beyond help. He had absorbed a lethal dose of neutrons and suffered massive physical trauma. He died minutes later. Burns was found nearby, dead. But where was the third man? Richard Legg was missing. They searched the small operating floor. They looked behind the equipment. They couldn't find him. It wasn't until one of the rescuers looked up into the shadows of the high ceiling that they realized the true horror of what had happened.
Richard Legg was pinned to the ceiling. A shield plug, a piece of steel protecting the top of the reactor, had been blown upward with such force that it had impaled him through the groin and pinned him into the insulation of the roof, 13 feet above the reactor floor. The investigators later pieced together the physics of the disaster. It happened in 4 milliseconds, faster than the human brain can process a thought. One of the men, likely Burns, had lifted the central control rod manually. He was only supposed to lift it 4 inches to connect it, but for some reason he lifted it 20 inches. The reactor went prompt critical. The power level surged from 0 to 20,000 megawatts in a fraction of a second. The uranium fuel plates grew so hot they instantly vaporized the water around them. The steam explosion hit the lid of the reactor vessel like a cannonball. The entire vessel, weighing 26,000 pounds, jumped 9 feet into the air, sharing all the pipes and killing the crew instantly. They were dead before their hands could even let go of the rod.
The recovery of the bodies was one of the most dangerous missions in peacetime history. The radiation was so intense that rescue teams could only stay inside for 60 seconds at a time. They had to use a crane with a shielded cab to pull the control rod from the ceiling to release Legg's body. The bodies were so radioactive that they could not be given to their families. They were hazardous waste. The army had to line standard caskets with lead and then place those caskets inside massive steel vaults filled with concrete. They were buried at night, in secret, to avoid panic. But the mystery remains. Why did Burns pull the rod too far? Was it an accident? The rod was heavy, but not that heavy. It required intent. Rumors began to swirl about a love triangle between the men, about marital strife and a fight on the operating floor. Some historians have suggested it was a murder-suicide, the first nuclear homicide. We will never know. The only witnesses are buried under tons of concrete in Idaho desert. The SL-1 sits there today, a buried mound of earth and basalt, a tomb for a machine that woke up for 4 milliseconds and destroyed everything it touched.
It is 1980. The location is the Karansky Quarry in the Donetsk region of Ukraine, part of the Soviet Union. It is a massive, dusty pit where workers blast limestone out of the earth to mix into concrete for new apartment buildings. To measure the level of gravel in the hopper, they use a device equipped with a radioactive source. It is a small, silver capsule containing cesium-137. It is roughly the size of a pencil eraser, but it emits a constant, powerful stream of gamma radiation. One day, work stops. The sensor isn't working. The workers check the device and find it empty. The capsule has fallen out. They search the gravel, sifting through tons of crushed rock, but finding a silver piece of metal in a mountain of grey stone is impossible. They give up. The paperwork is filed, the loss is noted in a dusty ledger, and the concrete mixer keeps turning. The quarry resumes its work. The capsule is scooped up, mixed with cement, water and sand, and poured into a mould. It hardens into a prefabricated concrete panel. A panel that is then trucked to the city of Kramatorsk and lifted by a crane to become the wall of a bedroom in a brand new apartment building on Gwardesev-Kantemirovsev Street.
1981. A young family moves into apartment 85. They are happy. It is a good Soviet apartment, warm and sturdy. Their teenage daughter takes the bedroom. Her bed is placed right against the wall. For a year, everything is normal. But slowly the girl begins to feel tired. She loses weight. She complains of headaches. The doctors prescribe rest and vitamins, but she doesn't get better. In 1982, she dies suddenly of leukemia. She was 18 years old. The family is devastated, but they do not move. Leukemia is a tragedy, but it happens. A year later, her 16-year-old brother begins to show the same symptoms: the fatigue, the pale skin, the pain in his bones. He dies shortly after. Then the mother falls ill. By 1989, the entire family has perished or fallen gravely ill. The doctors are baffled. They suspect a hereditary genetic defect. The apartment is emptied. The tragedy is written off as bad blood.
A new family moves into apartment 85. They know nothing of the previous tenants. They place their son's bed in the same spot, right against the concrete wall. The cycle begins again. The son dies of leukemia. The father's health collapses. But this time, the father is suspicious. He realizes that everyone who sleeps in that specific room dies. He demands an investigation. He calls the health department, shouting that the apartment is cursed. He tells them it feels like the wall is breathing death. The officials are skeptical. They test the water. They check for mold. They find nothing. But the father insists. Finally, in 1989, 9 years after the capsule was lost, a radiologist arrives with a Geiger counter. He walks into the living room. The device is silent. He walks into the kitchen. Silent. He walks into the bedroom and approaches the wall. The Geiger counter screams. The radiation levels near the bed are 200 milliroentgens per hour, thousands of times higher than background radiation. They have found the killer. The residents are evacuated immediately. The wall is marked with a red X. They bring in a specialized team to dismantle the concrete.
They chip away at the plaster, carefully removing the gravel. And there, embedded in the center of the panel, sits the tiny silver capsule. It was stamped with the serial number from the quarry. For 9 years, it had been sitting inches from the heads of sleeping children, silently shredding their cells every night. It is a terrifying thought. We fear nuclear power plants and bombs, but sometimes the atomic shadow is not a cloud in the sky. Sometimes it is the wall you lean against when you close your eyes. The capsule was removed and disposed of at a nuclear waste facility. The building is still there. People still live in it. But apartment 85 remains a dark legend in the city of Kramatorsk, a reminder that the past is never truly buried. Sometimes it is built right into the architecture of our lives.
In the cold waters of the North Atlantic, on July 4th, 1961, a monster was lurking beneath the waves. It was the K-19, the pride of the Soviet Navy. It was the first of its kind, a nuclear-powered submarine armed with nuclear ballistic missiles. It was designed to hide in the deep, invisible, waiting for the order to burn American cities to ash. But the crew knew the truth. They didn't call it the pride of the fleet. They called it Hiroshima. From the moment its keel was laid, the ship was cursed. During its construction, a fire killed 2 workers. 6 women died from fumes while gluing the rubber lining in the water tanks. When the ship was finally christened, the traditional bottle of champagne did not break against the hull. It bounced off, intact. In the superstition of the sea, this is the ultimate bad omen. It means the ship will not be lucky. Now, deep under the ice, the curse was waking up. The captain, Nikolai Zateyev, was conducting training exercises. Suddenly, the pressure in the starboard reactor cooling system dropped to 0. A pipe had burst. The coolant was leaking out. The reactor temperature began to climb uncontrollably. There was no backup cooling system. The physics were simple and terrifying. Without coolant, the uranium fuel rods would heat up until they melted. If they melted, they would trigger a runaway nuclear chain reaction. The resulting steam explosion would not only destroy the sub, it would likely detonate the nuclear warheads on board. They were drifting near a NATO base. An explosion of that magnitude would look like a first strike. It wouldn't just be a sinking. It could be the start of World War III. Captain Zateyev had to make a choice. He had to cool the reactor. But the only way to do it was to send men inside the reactor compartment to weld a new cooling pipe by hand. They had no radiation suits. They had chemical suits, flimsy rubber that was useless against gamma rays. The captain asked for volunteers. He told them the truth. You will save the ship, but you will die.
The first team of 3 men went into the darkness. They opened the heavy steel door and were hit by a wall of blue light. The air inside was glowing. The radiation levels were so high that the ionization was visible to the naked eye. They worked in 10-minute shifts. Welding in that room was like welding inside the core of a star. They could feel their skin prickling, a sensation of thousands of tiny needles. They tasted ozone and metal. When the first team came out, they could barely stand. They were vomiting uncontrollably, but the horror was miserable. Their faces had swelled until they were unrecognizable. In just 20 minutes, the radiation had destroyed the capillaries in their skin. They looked, as one survivor recalled, like red monsters. The second team went in. then the third. They fixed the leak, they saved the ship. The temperature began to drop. But the radiation had leaked into the ventilation system. It spread through the entire submarine.
The K-19 limped home, surfacing to be towed by a diesel sub. The men who had entered the chamber were airlifted to a secret hospital in Moscow. They died within weeks. Their deaths were agonizing. Their bone marrow had been liquidated. Their bodies simply ceased to create new cells. To contain the radiation, they were buried in lead coffins. But the Soviet Union was a state of secrets. The families were not told how their sons died. They were told it was a special mission. The location of the graves was kept secret. The K-19 was repaired and sent back to sea. It suffered more fires, more collisions, and more deaths over the years, earning the nickname the Widowmaker. It wasn't until the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991 that the story was told. The survivors, now old men, gathered at the graves of the welders. They poured vodka on the ground for the boys who walked into the blue light to save the world, and got nothing in return but a lead box and 30 years of silence.
It was a crisp morning on January 17, 1966. The sky over the small fishing village of Palomares, Spain, was a piercing, cloudless blue. The farmers were tending to their tomato fields, and the fishermen were mending their nets on the beach. It was a scene of Mediterranean tranquility. High above them, at 31,000 feet, a deadly dance was taking place. A United States Air Force B-52 bomber was approaching a KC-135 tanker for a routine mid-air refueling. The bomber was carrying a payload of 4 hydrogen bombs, part of Operation Chrome Dome, a Cold War strategy to keep nuclear weapons in the air 24 hours a day, ready to strike the Soviet Union at a moment's notice. But the docking went wrong. The bomber came in too fast. It collided with the refueling boom. The sky suddenly ripped apart. An explosion disintegrated both planes. Fire rained down from the heavens. The fuselage of the bomber broke up, spinning wildly as it plummeted towards the sleepy village below. But the most terrifying part of the debris wasn't the burning metal. It was the 4 grey cylinders tumbling freely through the air, falling towards the tomato plants.
Of the 4 hydrogen bombs, 3 fell on the land, 1 fell into the sea. The bombs were equipped with parachutes to slow their descent, but on 2 of them, the parachutes failed. They slammed into the earth at high speed. They did not detonate in a nuclear yield. Safeties prevented that. But the conventional explosives inside them did explode. The blast shattered the bomb casings, pulverizing the plutonium core into a fine, radioactive dust. This dust was caught by the wind and blown across the village. It coated the whitewashed houses, the vegetable crops, and the hillsides. The 3rd bomb landed intact in a riverbed. The 4th, the one that fell into the sea, vanished into the deep blue water. Suddenly, a poor Spanish farming community was playing host to the most advanced and dangerous weapons on Earth. The villagers rushed to the crash sites, unaware that the smoke rising from the craters was full of alpha particles.
The American response was frantic. The code word was broken arrow, the military term for an accident involving a nuclear weapon. Within hours, the quiet village was invaded by hundreds of US Air Force troops in hazmat suits. They began a desperate cleanup effort. They couldn't just wash the plutonium away. They had to remove the earth itself. Soldiers spent weeks scraping the topsoil off the tomato fields, shoveling it into thousands of steel drums. To quell the panic, the US government staged a PR stunt.
The American ambassador and a Spanish minister went down to the beach in front of a wall of cameras and swam in the ocean to prove it was safe. They smiled and splashed in the water, while just a few miles away, men in white suits were sealing barrels of radioactive soil to be shipped all the way to a nuclear graveyard in South Carolina. But the fourth bomb was still missing. It was somewhere in the Mediterranean, lost in the underwater canyons. For 80 days, the US Navy searched. It was the most expensive salvage operation in history. They eventually found a local fisherman named Simo Orts who had seen the bomb fall. He pointed to a spot on the water and said, "It is there." The experts were skeptical of the illiterate fishermen, preferring their sonar and mathematics. But after weeks of failure, they listened to him. They sent down a submersible, the Alvin, and there, sitting precariously on a steep underwater slope, was the hydrogen bomb. It was wrapped in its parachute, looking like a sleeping grey shark. If it had slipped just a few meters further, it would have fallen into a deep trench and been lost forever. The bomb was recovered, but the shadow remains. Even today, traces of plutonium are found in the snails and the soil around Palomares. The US and Spain are still arguing over who should pay to clean up the lingering dust. It is a reminder that even when the sky is blue and the day is calm, the sword of Damocles hangs by a thread just above our heads.
It is December 1986. 8 months have passed since the world broke open at Chernobyl. The fires have been extinguished. The sarcophagus, a massive tomb of steel and concrete, has been hastily erected over the ruins of reactor number 4. The heroes are dead or dying in Moscow hospitals. The silence has returned to the exclusion zone. But deep inside the belly of the beast, something new has been born. A group of scientists, the liquidators, are tasked with the most dangerous job on Earth. They must re-enter the reactor building. They need to find the fuel. They need to know where the uranium went when the floor melted. They descend into the steam corridors beneath the reactor hall. It is a dungeon of twisted metal, flooded basements, and darkness. They carry cameras and simple flashlights. Their dosimeters tick furiously, a constant rhythm of danger. They turn a corner in a maintenance corridor, 2 meters below the reactor, and they see it.
It looked like a monster from a myth, a massive, black, wrinkled mass of slag that had flowed out of a steam pipe and settled in a heap on the floor. It looked like volcanic lava or the foot of a giant elephant. And so they named it the elephant's foot. But this was not rock. It was corium. It was a man-made lava, a terrifying mixture of melted nuclear fuel, concrete, sand, and steel, all fused together at temperatures hotter than the surface of the sun. When they found it, it was still radiating heat, but it was also radiating death. The radiation level near the foot was measured at 10,000 rontgens per hour. To stand next to it for 3 minutes was a death sentence. To look at it was to look into the eyes of Medusa. The radiation was so intense that it unraveled the film in their cameras, leaving the photos grainy and ghostly, as if the air itself was boiling.
One man, Artur Korniev, was brave enough, or perhaps mad enough, to approach it. He was a specialist in nuclear fuel. He wanted to study the monster. In the grainy photographs that exist, you can see him. He wears a heavy protective suit, but he looks small next to the black mass. He discovered that the substance was harder than steel. When they tried to drill into it to take a sample, the drill bits snapped. When they shot it with a Kalashnikov rifle, the bullets just bounced off. It was indestructible. The elephant's foot is arguably the most dangerous object on the planet. For years, it remained hot, eating its way through 2 meters of concrete, threatening to burn right down into the groundwater. It sat there in the dark, a silent, glowing heart of the disaster, pulsating with enough energy to kill a city, yet motionless as a stone.
Today, nearly 40 years later, the elephant's foot is still there. It has cooled significantly, but it is still warm. It still emits enough radiation to kill a human if they linger too long. It is slowly turning to dust, shedding radioactive particles into the air of the sarcophagus. It serves as the ultimate grim monument to the atomic age. We split the atom to create light, to create power, to create a sun on Earth. But in doing so, we created monsters that will outlive us. The elephant's foot will remain dangerous for 100,000 years, long after the concrete sarcophagus crumbles, long after the exclusion zone is forgotten, and perhaps long after our civilization has faded into history. The Medusa in the basement will still be there, waiting in the dark. Thank you for joining me in the dreamscape of history. If these stories of the atomic shadow have kept you awake or helped you sleep, please leave a like and subscribe. Until next time, keep your distance and watch the Geiger counter.